Night settles slowly over the Chihuahuan desert around the Redrock stage station. Wind moves across the open land in long, steady breaths, slipping through the ribs of the wooden fence and whispering through clusters of prickly pear and low desert cactus. The boards of the stable creak softly. Somewhere inside, a horse shifts its weight, leather tack brushing against rough wood. A yellow oil lamp glows in the small kitchen window. The porch itself sits in darkness, its planks worn smooth by years of boots and desert dust. Beyond the yard, the road disappears into the wide black stretch of the Chihuahuan night, a pale ribbon of dust that has carried travelers across this country for decades. The air smells of dry earth, saddle leather, hay, and wood smoke drifting faintly from the kitchen stove. Inside that kitchen, Maggie Holt stands very still. An oil lamp burns in her hand, throwing soft gold light across the rough plank floor and the table where Cass Whitmore sits. She looks straight at him. "You should go." Cass opens his mouth as if to answer. Maggie doesn't move. "Go," she repeats. Her voice doesn't rise. It doesn't tremble. It simply settles in the room like something already decided. Cass studies her for a moment longer. His chair scrapes quietly against the floor as he stands. He reaches for his hat, and then he leaves. Maggie remains where she is, the lamp still in her hand, listening. Outside, a saddle creaks. Hooves shift in the dirt. A horse turns toward the road. The sound of hoofbeats carries out into the dark desert, growing softer as the distance widens, until even the wind swallows it. Only then does Maggie lower the lamp. She sets it on the kitchen table, stares at the empty doorway, and finally sinks down onto the wooden floor and cries. Redrock stands alone in the Chihuahuan desert, miles from the nearest town. Maggie's parents built the station 20 years ago when the stage route still mattered, raising the stable, the kitchen, and the spare rooms, board by board. They died when Maggie was 20. 7 years have passed since then, 7 years of running Redrock alone. She never stayed because she lacked options. She stayed because this place was home. Cass Whitmore arrived in August with a limping horse and a quiet request. 3 days for a room. That was all he asked. 3 days became a week. A week became 11 weeks. And somewhere inside those ordinary days, Maggie began to notice something she hadn't expected. There is a difference between silence when you are alone and silence when someone else is there beside you. Somewhere along the way, Cass Whitmore had become part of that silence, and that was the part Maggie had not allowed herself to see until it was already too late. Not every pain begins with betrayal. Sometimes it begins the moment you realize someone's presence has grown more important than you ever meant to allow. The Chihuahuan desert can hold a long silence, and sometimes in a place that empty, one person leaving can sound louder than anything else. But before we follow Maggie and Cass any farther into this story, tell me something. Where are you right now, and what are you doing while listening to this story? Are you somewhere quiet tonight, or somewhere that still remembers long roads, dry wind, and a porch light after dark? Maggie Holt is 27 years old, though people who meet her at Redrock often assume she is older. Not because her face looks aged, but because there is a steadiness in the way she moves that rarely belongs to someone still in their 20s. Her hair is thick and black, usually tied back quickly at the base of her neck before the day begins. By mid-morning, loose strands always escape and cling to her temples when the desert heat rises. Her skin carries the deep bronze tone of someone who has worked under the New Mexico sun for years. The color is even across her arms, her neck, and the strong lines of her shoulders. Her face is open and full, rounded cheeks, a soft chin, and wide lips that rarely speak more than necessary. Her eyes are dark and direct, but there is a caution behind them, the kind that comes from watching people long enough to know what they might say next. Her body is not small. Her shoulders are broad from lifting hay bales and hauling water buckets. Her arms carry the quiet strength of someone who has spent years working with tools and animals. Her hips and waist are full, the solid build of a woman who has lived a physical life rather than a careful one. When she stands, she does not fold inward or shrink from the space she occupies. She plants her feet firmly and moves with the balance of someone used to uneven ground and loose stone. Her hands tell even more of the story. The palms are lightly calloused from hammer handles, reins, and rope. The fingers move quickly and efficiently, whether they are driving nails into a loose board, scrubbing a pot, or writing numbers into the station ledger at the end of a long day. There is very little wasted motion in the way Maggie works. A plain work dress, usually dusted red by the desert soil, sits beneath a thick apron she ties tight at the waist. Her boots are worn smooth across the toes from years of stable floors and hard ground. When the mornings turn cold, she pulls on a heavy coat that once belonged to her father. Most days begin before sunrise. She lights the stove, checks the water trough, feeds the horses, sweeps the porch, and starts breakfast before the first traveler ever reaches the road. By noon, she may have cooked for 20 men passing through the station, repaired a loose section of roof, balanced the week's accounts, and replaced a worn horseshoe. For 7 years, Maggie Holt has done all of it herself. When her parents died suddenly, most people expected the station to close within months. A young woman alone in the middle of the Chihuahuan desert did not seem like a practical arrangement. But Maggie stayed. She learned every task her father had once done and every small management detail her mother had handled quietly behind the scenes. Over time, travelers stopped asking when she planned to sell the place. They simply accepted that Redrock belonged to Maggie Holt. Along the way, she also heard the comments people sometimes made when they thought she was out of earshot, about her body, about the fact that a woman like her still ran the station alone. She learned to let those remarks pass through the air without letting them settle inside her. That was the price of her independence. Maggie does not fear doing life on her own. The thing she fears is something else entirely, giving her trust to the wrong person and having to gather the broken pieces of herself all over again. And Cass Whitmore is exactly the kind of man who makes a person wonder whether trust would be a mistake or the bravest choice she has left. Cass Whitmore is 38 years old. He is the kind of man people notice the moment he steps through a doorway, not because he tries to draw attention, but because there is simply too much of him to overlook. He stands a little over 6'3", tall enough that most ceilings feel lower when he walks beneath them. His shoulders are broad and heavily built, the long result of 2 decades of outdoor labor rather than any deliberate effort to shape his body. His back is thick and straight, and the strength in his arms is the quiet kind that comes from years of hauling saddles, repairing fences, and managing horses that weigh half a ton. Nothing about him looks decorative. His body is lean and dry, every line built for work rather than display. The muscles in his forearms tighten visibly when he lifts something heavy, and his hands carry the thick calluses of reins, rope, and hard tools. His face carries its own history, a square jaw that rarely softens, a nose that was broken once and healed slightly crooked, thin lines at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into desert sunlight. Those eyes are dark brown, steady, and direct. When Cass Whitmore looks at someone, he does not glance away quickly. He studies people the same way a man studies weather on the horizon, calm and patient, as if he has learned that most things reveal themselves if you simply watch long enough. Dust from the road seems permanently worked into his clothes. A weathered black hat sits low on his head. His shirt is plain work cloth faded by sun and years of washing. His trousers are reinforced at the knees. His boots are built for long rides and uneven ground, the leather cracked but well cared for. A worn gun belt rests easily around his waist, not displayed like a warning, but carried the way a ranch hand carries tools he may or may not need that day. Cass does not talk much. When travelers sit around the Redrock table telling stories about cattle drives or card games in distant towns, he listens more than he speaks. If someone asks him a direct question, he answers simply and then returns to his quiet. But he works. That becomes clear within the first week of his stay. A gate that has sagged for months suddenly swings clean again. A loose hinge on the barn door stops squealing. A section of fence along the road is quietly repaired before Maggie even notices it needed fixing. Cass never asks permission to help, and he never acts like the station belongs to him. He simply notices what is broken and fixes it. When evening comes, he sits on the porch steps or leans against the stable rail, watching the desert fade into the long copper light of sunset. He does not fill the air with conversation, yet his silence never feels heavy. Men who pass through Redrock recognize the type almost immediately. Cass Whitmore is a drifter in the oldest Western sense of the word. A cowboy who has spent nearly 18 years moving from ranch to ranch, following cattle work, open range, and the rhythm of seasons. He has never stayed anywhere long, not because he is chased away, but because staying has simply never been part of the way he lives. And that is exactly what makes Maggie Holt's quiet suspicion so difficult to ignore. Men like Cass Whitmore rarely build lives in one place. They pass through, they ride on, and the desert closes behind them like they were never there. 3 days. That was the agreement when Cass Whitmore first brought his limping horse into the yard at Redrock. 3 days for a room, food, and a stall in the barn while the animal rested. Maggie Holt had written the date in the station ledger without thinking much about it. Travelers came and went every week. Some stayed one night, some stayed 2. 3 days should have passed the same way. But 3 days turned into a week quietly stretched into 11 weeks. No one formally asked for the arrangement to continue. It simply unfolded the way small changes sometimes do in places as wide and quiet as the Chihuahuan desert. Cass began slipping into the daily rhythm of Redrock without announcing himself. The first thing Maggie noticed was the gate. For months the hinge had sagged just enough that it scraped the dirt every time she opened it. One morning she walked out with a bucket and realized the gate swung clean and silent. Later that same afternoon she saw Cass leaning against the fence rail, tightening a bolt with a small wrench from his saddlebag. He didn't mention it. A few days later, a section of the outer fence that had started to lean was standing straight again. Then the water trough was repaired. Then the loose boards on the barn roof were nailed down before the next desert storm could rip them loose. Cass never moved through the station as if he had taken control of it. That was something Maggie noticed immediately. He did not step into spaces that belonged to her. He simply filled the quiet gaps where there had not been another pair of hands for years. The days developed their own quiet pattern. Morning arrived early in the desert. Before the sky even began to pale, Maggie lit the stove and started the first pot of coffee. The kitchen filled slowly with the smell of beans and wood smoke. By the time the light began touching the edges of the stable roof, Cass was usually already outside. He moved through the barn quietly, checking the horses, filling the water buckets, and brushing down whichever animal had been ridden hardest the day before. The early light would slide across the yard while the two of them worked in separate corners of the same space. Neither felt the need to fill those minutes with conversation. By mid-morning, travelers began arriving. Redrock sat along one of the rougher desert routes, and wagons often pulled in coated with a thick layer of dust. Maggie handled the kitchen, cooking eggs, bread, and whatever meat she had smoked earlier that week. Cass handled the yard. He led horses to water, checked saddle straps, and lifted heavy supply crates down from wagon beds. It never became a spoken arrangement. They simply moved around each other with the natural coordination of two people who were paying attention. Afternoons stretched slower. When the travelers rode out again, the station often fell quiet except for the low wind crossing the desert floor. Sometimes Maggie worked on accounts at the kitchen table while Cass repaired tack outside under the shade of the stable wall. Sometimes he cut firewood. Sometimes she joined him in the yard to check the roof or move feed sacks that had arrived with a supply wagon. They did not hurry through the work. The Chihuahuan desert had its own rhythm, and anyone who lived long enough inside it eventually learned that rushing rarely improved anything. Evenings became the quietest time of all. The sun sank low behind the distant hills, turning the desert floor copper red before the light faded completely. Most nights Maggie carried 2 cups of coffee out to the porch. Cass would already be sitting there or leaning against the railing. They watched the land darken slowly. Coyotes sometimes called far out in the distance. Other nights there was nothing but wind. The silence between them never felt empty. That was the first thing Maggie noticed changing inside herself. For 7 years she had lived surrounded by silence. She had grown used to it the way people grow used to the sound of their own breathing. The quiet of Redrock had always been part of her life. But this was different. There was a difference between silence when you were alone and silence when someone else was sitting beside you. Maggie realized it one evening without warning. Cass had said almost nothing that entire night. He simply sat there with his elbows resting on his knees, looking out across the fading desert. And yet the porch no longer felt like a place she was waiting to leave. It felt like somewhere shared, somewhere steady. Cass Whitmore had become part of Redrock long before Maggie allowed herself to admit it, not through grand gestures or dramatic promises, through habit, through the small daily presence of a man who showed up every morning and quietly carried his part of the day. There are people who arrive in a life like a storm. Cass had arrived like something quieter, like a second heartbeat slowly becoming part of the house, and Maggie Holt did not realize how deeply that rhythm had settled into her days until the moment it was threatened. Because in the 11th week, behind the kitchen door, Maggie overheard a conversation that turned everything she thought she understood upside down. The 11th week began like the 10 weeks before it. The desert morning came pale and cold. Maggie lit the stove before sunrise. Cass moved through the stable yard with quiet efficiency, checking water troughs and brushing dust from the backs of the horses that had arrived the night before. Nothing about the day suggested it would be different. By mid-afternoon, 3 riders came in from the south road, their horses sweating and their saddlebags thick with dust from the long ride up from Las Cruces. Travelers like that were common enough at Redrock. Maggie put stew on the stove and started slicing bread, while Cass helped the men settle their horses. She recognized one thing immediately. One of the riders recognized Cass. There was a pause in the yard, the kind that comes when 2 men realize they know each other from somewhere far away. A handshake followed. Quiet laughter. A few low words Maggie could not hear clearly from the kitchen window. She did not think much about it. People crossed paths on the frontier all the time. The trouble began later that evening. Maggie was carrying a tray of bowls toward the dining table when she heard voices through the thin wooden door that separated the kitchen from the main room. Cass had stepped outside a moment earlier to check the horses. The 3 men remained at the table. Their voices were relaxed in the careless way men sometimes speak when they assume the person they are talking about cannot hear them. One of them said Cass had always been good at finding comfortable places to stay. Another laughed. Man like him finds a woman running a station alone. He's not leaving any time soon. Someone else added something quieter. She looks like the kind who'd be grateful just to have a man sit beside her. Big girl running a place out here by herself. Probably thinks he's doing her a favor. The men laughed. The sound moved through the wooden boards like cold air. Maggie stood perfectly still behind the kitchen door. The tray in her hands felt heavier than it should have. The insult itself was not new. Maggie had heard versions of it for years, about her body, about the idea that a woman like her should feel fortunate for attention. Those words alone would not have shaken her. But something else followed immediately behind them, a thought she had not invited, a question she had never allowed herself to ask. What if they were right? Cass had arrived with a lame horse and a request for 3 days. 11 weeks later, he was still here. He had repaired fences, hauled water, worked the yard, and sat beside her every evening while the desert darkened. Maggie had slowly allowed herself to believe those things meant something. Now, suddenly, the same moments rearranged themselves into another shape. Maybe he had simply found an easy place to stay. Maybe every quiet gesture had been nothing more than convenience. The idea landed inside her chest like a stone. By the time she carried the bowls out to the table, Maggie's face looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. But something inside her had shifted, and once doubt enters a room like that, it begins quietly changing the meaning of everything around it. That night, long after the travelers had gone to bed and the desert wind had settled outside the station walls, Maggie Holt stood alone in the kitchen, trying to decide what hurt more. The possibility that Cass had been using her, or the realization that she had begun to trust him enough for that idea to matter. It is close to midnight when Maggie Holt makes the decision. The Redrock station has fallen quiet. The 3 travelers from Las Cruces are asleep in the guest rooms upstairs. Outside, the Chihuahuan desert stretches black and wide beneath a sky thick with stars. Wind slides across the open land and rattles the loose edge of the stable door. Inside the kitchen, the only light comes from a single oil lamp burning on the table. Cass Whitmore sits there, one arm resting on the wood, the other hand wrapped loosely around a tin cup of coffee that has already gone cold. He looks up when Maggie steps in. She stands across the room with her back straight, the lamp in her hand casting long shadows against the wall. For a moment, neither of them speaks. Cass studies her face carefully. He has spent 11 weeks learning the quiet language of her expressions, and he can see immediately that something inside her has changed. "Maggie," he says. Her voice comes before he can say anything else. "You should go." Cass frowns slightly. "What happened?" "Nothing happened." Her tone is calm, almost too calm. "Your horse is healed. You've stayed longer than you planned. It's time for you to move on." Cass does not move right away. He watches her the same way he watches a storm gathering on the horizon. "Maggie." She lifts her chin slightly. "Go." The word lands between them like a door closing. Cass could argue. He could ask more questions. But he doesn't. Slowly, he pushes his chair back from the table and stands. The sound of the wooden legs scraping the floor feels louder than it should in the quiet kitchen. He reaches for his hat. There is a long moment when it seems he might say something. Instead, he simply nods once. "All right?" That is the part Maggie is not prepared for. She had expected anger, a defense, maybe even a lie. What she receives instead is quiet acceptance. Cass places the hat on his head and walks past her toward the door. He pauses briefly beside her, close enough that she can smell dust and leather from the stable. Still, he says nothing. Then he steps outside. A few minutes later, the sound of a saddle cinch tightening carries through the night air. Hoofbeats follow. They grow faint quickly in a desert as wide as this one. Inside the kitchen, Maggie stands perfectly still until the sound disappears entirely into the wind. Only then does she set the lamp down. She lowers herself slowly to the wooden floor and presses her palms against her eyes, because the truth she had not wanted to face presses against her chest now. She did not send Cass away because she knew he was lying. She sent him away because she could not bear the 2 answers that might have followed if she asked the question. If he had admitted the men were right, her trust would have shattered. But if he had told her the truth, if he had told her he meant to stay, then Maggie Holt would have had to confront a far more dangerous possibility, that she no longer wanted the life she had built alone. Sometimes the hardest boundary to cross is not between 2 people. It is the one between who you have always been and who you might become if you let someone else stay. And by the time the desert wind finally settles against the walls of Redrock that night, Cass Whitmore is already riding into the darkness beyond the station lights. For a long time after the hoofbeats disappear, Maggie Holt does not move. The oil lamp burns quietly on the kitchen table, its small flame swaying every time the wind presses lightly against the station walls. The room smells faintly of coffee and wood smoke, the same way it has every night for years. But the silence inside the kitchen feels different now. Maggie lowers herself slowly onto the floorboards. The wood is cool beneath her palms. For 11 weeks she had grown used to hearing another pair of footsteps moving through the house. Boots crossing the porch. The quiet creak of the stable door. The sound of someone settling into the chair across the table. Now those sounds are gone, and the absence is louder than she ever expected it to be. Maggie presses her hand over her mouth as the first tears come. She had not cried in weeks, not since Cass arrived at Redrock, but now the weight of the moment settles fully inside her chest. Not because she misses his help. She has managed the station alone for 7 years. She can do it again. What breaks something open inside her is realizing that for the first time in those 7 years, she had begun to feel less alone, and she had sent that feeling away before it could grow into something she might not survive losing. The next 2 days move slowly. The desert morning still arrives at the same hour. Maggie still lights the stove before sunrise. Horses still need feeding. Travelers still appear on the road. The work continues exactly as it always has. But the rhythm of the station feels off, as if something that had quietly balanced the place has been removed. The porch in the evening is the worst part. Maggie sits there out of habit with her cup of coffee, watching the desert sky turn copper and then dark. There is no one beside her. The silence returns to what it used to be, and she realizes she no longer experiences it the same way. On the third morning, Maggie is brushing one of the horses in the stable when she hears something that makes her stop. Hoofbeats, slow, steady. They approach from the road and stop in the yard. Maggie does not move right away. She keeps the brush moving across the horse's back, even though the rhythm of her hand has changed. Boots touch the dirt outside the barn. Then footsteps. Cass Whitmore appears in the open doorway of the stable. Sunlight from the yard pours in behind him, turning his shape into a dark silhouette against the bright desert morning. He stops there without stepping inside. Maggie. She continues brushing the horse for another moment before finally turning to face him. "You forget something?" she asks. Her voice is steady. Cass studies her carefully. "I rode 2 days," he says quietly. "Then I stopped." Maggie waits. "I don't know what you heard that night," he continues, "but I know you heard something." The stable stands silent except for the soft shifting of the horse between them. Maggie lifts her chin slightly. "They said you were using me." Cass nods once. "I figured it might be something like that." He steps 1 pace closer, but keeps several feet of space between them. "I left because you told me to," he says. "But I came back because some things shouldn't stay unsaid." The morning light settles across the stable floor between them, and Maggie Holt realizes the man she sent away has returned for a reason heavier than pride. Sometimes the most important moment in a story is not when someone walks away. It is when they choose to come back and face what was left behind. The stable remains quiet after Cass speaks. Dust drifts slowly through the beam of morning light falling from the open doorway. The horse Maggie had been brushing shifts its weight and exhales softly, the sound warm in the still air. For a moment, neither of them moves. Cass Whitmore stands a few steps inside the stable, hat low over his brow, hands resting loosely at his sides. The 2 days of riding have left a faint gray dust across his coat and boots. Maggie sets the brush down on the wooden rail beside her. "What is it you came back to say?" she asks. Cass takes a breath, as if measuring the weight of the words before letting them out. I rode 2 days south, he says. Got as far as the ridge past Arroyo Mesa. He pauses briefly. And I realized something. Maggie waits, arms folded loosely across her chest. I couldn't keep riding. That is not the answer she expected. Cass continues, his voice calm but steady. I've been moving most of my life, ranch to ranch, season to season. Never saw much reason to stay anywhere once the work was done. His gaze lifts and settles on her. But these past 11 weeks weren't like that. The stable holds the quiet between them. I didn't stay because I ran out of places to go, Cass says. There are always more places. Another pause. I stayed because every morning there was a reason not to leave. Maggie's fingers tightened slightly against her sleeves. And that reason, Cass finishes, was you. The words land softly but firmly. Maggie looks down for a moment, studying the rough boards of the stable floor as if the answer might be written somewhere in the grain of the wood. I don't know how to do this, she says finally. Cass tilts his head slightly. Do what? This. She gestures vaguely between them. Let someone else into the life I've been running by myself for 7 years. Her voice is honest, not defensive. I built Redrock so I wouldn't have to depend on anyone, she continues quietly. Everything here works because I know exactly how it runs. Cass nods slowly. That makes sense. You say that like it's simple, Maggie says. It is simple, he replies. Not easy, but simple. She lifts her eyes to meet his. Cass shifts his weight slightly and speaks the words he has carried back across 2 days of desert. I can't unknow you, Maggie. The sentence is plain, almost rough in its simplicity, but it carries a weight that neither of them can ignore. I've known a lot of places, he continues, a lot of people. But once you know someone the way I know you now, you don't just go back to the way things were before. He holds her gaze. I don't want to go back to that. Maggie feels something inside her chest loosen, something she has held tight for years. I'm not good at this, she says again, quietly. Cass's mouth lifts into the smallest hint of a smile. Neither am I. A moment passes. Then he adds, and simply, but I'd like to learn. He gestures lightly toward the station yard outside the stable doors. Here, with you. The words are not dramatic. They are not a promise of perfection. They are something quieter and far more real. Two people standing in the dusty light of a stable, admitting they do not know exactly how to build something together, but choosing not to walk away from the chance. Sometimes the most important decision in a life is not the road you take. It is the moment you decide you are done riding past the place you belong. Cass Whitmore does not rent another room at Redrock. Instead, 3 days after that conversation in the stable, Maggie notices him carrying a small stack of boards toward the old storage shed behind the barn. The building had once held spare harnesses and wagon tools years earlier. But time and desert wind had slowly worn it down. The door stuck half the time. One window frame leaned crooked against the wall. Cass spends most of that afternoon working on it. He sands the door so it swings smoothly again. He replaces the broken window glass with a square pane he cuts from an old crate lid. By evening he has patched the worst gaps in the roof. He does not announce what he is doing. He simply makes the small shed livable. That is where he moves his saddle and bedroll. It is not a dramatic declaration, but it is a clear one. He is no longer just passing through. The first month is not easy. 7 years of running Redrock alone has given Maggie a very specific way of doing things. Tools belong in certain places. Feed sacks are stacked in a particular order. The ledger is written in her careful, precise handwriting at the same hour every night. Cass has his own habits shaped by nearly 2 decades of drifting ranch work. Sometimes those habits collide. One evening, Maggie points out that he stacked the supply crates in a way that blocks the back door. Cass studies the arrangement, nods once, and moves them without complaint. Another morning, Maggie finds him lying half beneath the water pump outside the stable, sleeves rolled and hands covered in oil, as he repairs a valve that had been sticking for months. She watches for a moment, then disappears into the kitchen. A few minutes later, she returns with 2 cups of coffee. Cass accepts one without pausing his work. Maggie sits beside the pump, holding the lantern so he can see the small bolts more clearly. Neither of them says, "Thank you." They both understand something larger is happening. Weeks pass. Redrock begins to feel slightly different. Not louder, not busier, just steadier. One evening near the end of the season, a rider from Texas stops for supper. During the meal, he mentions a ranch in Pecos County looking for a man with Cass's experience. Good pay, long-term work. The rider leaves a folded sheet of paper on the table before heading back to the road. Cass reads it after dinner while Maggie washes the last of the dishes. The kitchen is quiet except for the sound of water against metal. "Maggie," he says. She does not turn around. "What?" "They want an answer by morning." "Then you should give them one." Her voice stays level. Cass folds the paper once more. Then he tears it cleanly down the middle. The sound of the rip is sharp in the small kitchen. Maggie turns just in time to see him drop the 2 pieces onto the table. "I already found the place I want to stay," he says. The desert outside Redrock remains exactly what it has always been, wide, dry, silent. But inside the little station kitchen, one man has quietly chosen not to ride past it again. The Chihuahuan desert never says much. It simply watches. It watches the travelers who pass through like brief weather across the land. It watches the ones who stop for a night, then ride on before the sun rises again. And sometimes it watches something rarer, a person who arrives without meaning to stay, and the quiet moment when they decide they are no longer leaving. The desert does not celebrate those moments. It just holds them there in the wind, the dust, and the long silence of open land. Because sometimes the most important change in a life is not dramatic at all. Sometimes it is simply the moment someone stops pretending that being alone was enough. Out there in the Chihuahuan desert, some people pass through like weather, and some stay long enough to change the shape of a life. Before we leave Maggie and Cass in that little kitchen at Redrock, I want to ask you something. Do you believe there are people we meet that we truly can't go back from knowing? People who don't rescue us, but make it impossible to keep pretending that being alone is enough? Tell me what you think in the comments, and if someone like that has ever existed in your life, share that too. I read every comment under these stories.